All right. Lesson number one. No, it's not the new Metallica. Although I'm sure I'll end up with a Metallica song one of these mornings somewhere. Comparing security roles and security controls. Without any further ado, lesson numero uno. Number one. In this lesson, we're going to talk about just like some different security roles inside the company. We'll talk about some basic security concepts. And we're slowly going to work our way into some legal stuff. I'm sure there's more than a couple people here just getting situated and getting back, so I'll give them a second before we go any further. Alrighty. So we're going to start by comparing and contrasting information security roles, as in jobs. And before we go into that too far, we want to touch on this CIA triad, and that kind of makes sense because this is basically the foundation of any security concept. The idea that you need these three things in order to have security at all. You need confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's the C, I, and A respectively. And when we say confidentiality, we mean about keeping secrets secret. As far as the how goes for confidentiality, there are several different ways we can do this, but the most straightforward is encryption. I could also say access control. I could say need to know. Sort of all these different things apply some level of confidentiality. Like I could encrypt the file and limit who has the ability to gain access to the encryption key, thereby sort of providing access control and limiting who can decrypt the file, thereby keeping our secrets secret. There's a million and one different ways to try and keep a secret secret, and all of that sort of sums up in the concept of just confidentiality. And certainly you need that to some amount in a business, or else everything you have will be public, and then your enemies, other sort of adversaries out there could damage the company very easily. As far as I goes, integrity, that's about making sure that data is not tampered with, that all modifications and transfers and so forth are authorized. So let's see here. Hashing is a great way to promote integrity. We can hash a file, then check the hash values to detect whether or not the file has been tampered with. The limit who can access or change a file. Again, access control, that works here too. Access control can be applied not just to keep the secret secret, but also limit who can edit something. Even go so far as to say, to some degree, signatures. And I'm not talking about somebody signing their name on the dotted line kind of thing. I'm talking about signatures in the encryption sense. In this sort of thing made out of both a combination of hashing and encryption, we get signatures. And signatures give us the ability to provide some amount of integrity. Of course, they do more than that. And really, signatures are tied more than anything to non-repudiation. Now, non-repudiation is not part of the CIA triad so much as it is like a secondary principle of the triad, in the same way that you have primary colors and secondary colors, red, yellow, blue if you're dealing with paints, if you're dealing with light, red, green, and blue. When you mix the primary things, you can get some secondary principles, those secondary colors, and non-repudiation is a secondary principle to the CIA triad that is based entirely off of signatures. And we have an entire lesson about signatures later today. But what about that letter A? Availability. Making sure we can get to data when we need it. Key word, when we need it. We can do this through having backups. That helps promote availability. Redundant array of independent disks, known as RAID. How about load balancing? What about, let's see here, additional forms of availability? Hell, even just talking about like fiber cables being faster than a conventional copper cable is a form of availability. But let's see here, even the cloud to some degree has a high level of availability tied to it, sort of just mass amounts of redundancy, thereby making it easier to get to the data when you need it. So you need a little bit of CI and A, no matter the business, no matter the organization, to have security. And I'm not just talking about like security in the sense of keeping secret, just confidentiality. I'm talking about just all of it together, security and stability for the business, for the organization, so that they can have a resemblance of stability in their processes. To do so, we will need the CIA triad. We will need some measure of confidentiality, some measure of integrity, and some measure of availability to exist in this modern era. So the CIA triad is going to be important to any business, and ultimately, one of the first steps in any business's security plan is to write the overarching corporate policy for security. And in that policy, you're going to outline the importance of confidentiality, integrity, and availability to the organization, and in what measure each of those is needed. Again, you'll need all three of them, but one might be favored more than the other. For example, if I was a hospital and I had to follow HIPAA regulations, the Healthcare Information Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, which of these three do you think I'd probably focus on more than the others? Again, they're going to care about all three, but one of them, at least as far in the eyes of HIPAA, is more important than the others. Most of the HIPAA laws about what? Absolutely. Great, good comments, everybody. Good job, Kelly, Raymond, Dylan. Yes, confidentiality. Hospitals. Not a lot of room there, the right hospitals. All about that confidentiality. All right. What about banks? Banks care about confidentiality, but you know what they care about more? Integrity. In fact, most of the banking regulations like PCI DSS, the payment card industry data security standard, focuses on the idea that people can't tamper with your bank account balances. There aren't a lot of laws that say we have to keep your bank account balance a secret. Almost all the laws are about making sure no one tampers with your bank account balance. That's integrity. Banks are heavily focused on integrity. Again, they care about confidentiality, but you put them next to each other, integrity every time. And if we were talking about an internet service provider, a cloud service provider, or even maybe just something like Netflix or Facebook, if we were going to call out somebody by name, they're going to be focused on availability, because if their service is offline, they do not get paid. So certainly different businesses will focus on C, I, or A more than the others, but you need all three in some measure. Now, it just so happens that two of them are sort of at war with each other. Confidentiality and availability are sort of like on a seesaw. If you have a lot of confidentiality, the availability will suffer as a consequence. If you have a high availability, confidentiality will suffer as a consequence. A way of sort of illustrating this is, if you could imagine, if we wanted to get maximum confidentiality, I could take some notes I have for this class. I could encrypt them. I could take those notes and put it in a safe, seal the safe in like a block of steel and concrete, and then throw it into a hidden place in the ocean. I've just maximized confidentiality. Of course, in the course of doing so, I've really minimized my availability. To access that document, I now have to go out into the ocean, bring up this giant steel concrete case, crack it open, unlock the safe, get the document out, decrypt it, and only then can I read it. So like maximizing confidentiality causes availability to suffer. And conversely, if I try to maximize availability, I start making copies of said document, putting them all over my office, and now the likelihood that somebody else sees them starts going up, so confidentiality sort of plummets in response. So confidentiality and availability are always going to be at ends with each other. And that just brings me back more to this whole organization has to decide what it wants, how it's going to achieve it, and outline that in the security policy so that we can properly maintain the balance between these three components. Now, what is non-repudiation? Because I imagine the idea of confidentiality and integrity and availability is not too hard to interpret. So non-repudiation, however, is, and thereby we should kind of spend a little bit more time talking about that. Here's what repudiate means. To copy. To repudiate is to copy. And if I was to tell you something and then you were to tell someone and then they were to tell someone and then they were to tell someone, we sort of whisper down the lane, sort of like how rumors spread, that is the repudiation of information. And if you've ever seen how a rumor can spread and evolve over time, you've seen the real fault of repudiation, that the message loses its integrity over time as it passes from one party to another. The idea behind non-repudiation is that we can tell exactly where data came from and that it was not tampered with. That someone cannot deny having created something and or modifying it. We know where it came from and that it hasn't been tampered with. This is heavily tied to integrity, but it goes past that, right? Because integrity is just about detecting tampering and limiting tampering. This actually tells us where something came from, when it was created, and by whom, and that there can be no denying of such. As William pointed out, it's basically ownership, proving ownership of said data. And we can do this through signatures, which ultimately is going to be a combination of encryption, specifically a form of asymmetrical encryption, and hashing. And when we use those two together, we can make a signature to prove exactly where something came from. I think this slide probably gets the most time out of any slide. All right, give you a second there if you're taking some notes. I know I've written quite a bit there on the screen. We will proceed here in just a moment. All right. So as promised, let's talk about different security roles in an organization now that we've sort of gotten this fundamental concept out of the way. Who has the overall responsibility in an organization to determine how much we care about the CIA triad and in what measure? How about the Chief Security Officer or the Chief Information Security Officer, the CSO or the CISO? I'm going to circle both of these acronyms because I'm sure you'll encounter them on the test. Information or just Security Officer, right? They're going to determine how much the business cares about CI&A. And they're probably going to make an informed decision based off of legal and regulatory requirements. Now, past them, We can all acknowledge that there will be managers in charges of, maintaining security for their individual departments. There'll be technical responsibilities, such as encrypting the hard drives and making sure that backups are properly managed and so forth. There'll even be non-technical requirements, proper management of paper and disposal of papers and things of that nature. And even just physical security is a thing to be considered. I will cross out or put a slash through this ISSO term, though. While the information system security officer is typically someone focused on the technical side of security inside the business, I don't think this is a term or acronym that we are going to see here in Sec Plus. And certainly if you did, you could probably infer the meaning of the ISSO through the question. Certainly I can't imagine a question specifically about that. So for the most part, acronyms on this test, there's a tons of them. But more often than not, you can infer their meaning without even knowing what the acronym stands for. Like in the case of CISO, they're not going to be like, what does this acronym stand for? There are no questions that are like that. Instead, what you'd get is they'd be like, the CISO does blank, blank, and blank. What's a problem with that third thing that they did? And in which case, you're really not focused on what CISO stands for as much as clearly this is some sort of security personnel and they have performed 3 actions. Why is the third action a problem? Almost irrelevant to the acronym. So there's not a whole lot of, in the grand scheme of things, of like, oh man, I got to know exactly what CISO stands for, as much as just recognize this is a person who manages security for the business. What the acronym stands for doesn't actually pan out to matter. But there will be plenty of acronyms on the test. Some vendors out there don't like putting acronyms on their tests. Certainly not the case for CompTIA. Acronyms galore. So CISO, CSO, we'll see them all the time, and certainly we're going to see those as well in the homework. How about this acronym? SOC, the Securities Operation Center, or the SOC. The idea of the Security Operations Center is this is a place from which someone will be doing incident response, sort of our crisis room. Now, in some organizations, this is really just, oh, there's a crisis. Let's commandeer, conference room number 1 or something like that. But some businesses will have a dedicated room for managing security from or performing incident response from. And behind us, we see the SOC for IBM, right? A pretty fancy room here that they have set up for specifically monitoring all sorts of different servers and so forth. As far as incident response goes, and we will see this again in, I believe it's lesson 17, which is basically all incident response, CIRT, CER, CSIRT. I think this first one's the most popular. Incident response team, basically. Whether it be computer incident response team, cyber incident response team, computer security, or computer emergency response team. These are the individuals in charge of responding to a security breach. And typically, where will you find this team operating? In the SOC, S-O-C. All right. These security professionals, whether they be incident response members or even more importantly, the management of the business, need to be familiar with the concepts of security controls, frameworks, policies, and guidelines, and what those different things are. Let's start with the different control categories. Managerial, operational, technical. Some slang term, too, for each of these. Managerial is sometimes known as administrative, or just admin for short. Operational controls, sort of day-to-day things, are typically physical in nature. Sometimes some people just call operational controls physical controls. And technical controls are all inside the computer, so they're usually referred to as logical controls. These are three different control categories that the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, has outlined for the sake of describing security controls. And a security control is used to mitigate a risk, to minimize a threat. Like, I'm worried about my family, food, and our shelter. So I make sure that I have a lock on my front door. Now, for that lock to function, I have to make sure that I, lock it every day. This is sort of an operational control and a perfect example of one. It happens to depend on a person for implementation, and furthermore, it is physical in nature. Now, what about the firewall on my network? What would that be considered? That'd be technical, that'd be logical, right? Because that's something inside the system. And what about a company policy that says employees are not allowed to do X, Y, and Z? Sort of guides their actions, determines how people interact. That's administrative. That's managerial. To give everybody a bit of a feel for, I guess, just in general, like what a simulation could conceptually feel like and or look like, I'm going to bring up a presentation from a very, very long time ago that sort of illustrates the idea of simulations and this topic exactly. Let me just find it here. There you are. So this isn't exactly anything that we're going to see on the current version of Sec Plus, but it certainly illustrates conceptually what like a simulation would look like while also illustrating our current topic. Drag and drop the labels of physical, technical, or administrative to describe the control type that will improve the security and accountability within the corporate asset management lifecycle. So you can grab any one of these, drag, drop, there you go. So for number one, I'll do it with you. And then I'll ask you to do number two. And we'll sort of skip back and forth between these. Release a policy requiring the use of cable locks. And I recognize entirely that cable locks are physical controls. However, the control in question is a policy that requires their use. A policy of this nature is going to guide how people act, and thereby is administrative. This is a managerial control. This policy hopefully will convince the employees to use the cable locks, and in this case, we're talking about the policy itself. How about this second one? What do you think this is? Use asset management forms to assign hardware to specific individuals. What does that one seem like? So it's a bit of a weird gray area. I cannot imagine that the forums themselves restrict anybody's ability to do much of anything. The forums themselves do not get in your way of sharing said hardware or limit your ability to hand it from one person to another. But certainly having forums that were used to assign hardware sort of governs how people act. If I am forced to use a forum in order to sign out a laptop, it definitely tells me like, hey, I'm responsible for this laptop, and sort of enforces a bit of a company policy upon me about, or at least expectation as to how I might want to manage this device. Ultimately, asset management forums themselves are the control in question, and this is a very bureaucratic sort of managerial type of mechanism. This is administrative. And you're probably thinking to yourself, well, if that isn't physical, what's an example of a physical control? Provide dock and lock cabinets for the storage of laptop computers, wherein the control is the dock and lock cabinet. And we can certainly all agree that in order for that cabinet to work or provide us any security at all, someone's going to have to use it. This is a perfect example of a physical control. The dock and lock cabinet does not try to persuade you to follow any guidelines in the same way that a form or policy might. It's just there. And only if you use it properly does it actually give you anything. This is absolutely our operational physical control. How about number 4 here? What do you think this one is? Implement full disk encryption on all portable devices. Ooh, see, lots of answers for technical. I could not agree more. Implementing full disk encryption. Where does full disk encryption occur? On the hard drive, inside the computer. This is most certainly a technical control. Remember the differences between these. Technical, aka logical controls, take place inside the computer. Administrative controls govern how people act, but don't necessarily govern how they act in the computer. Like, you can have something that's an administrative control, like an acceptable use policy that says, I will not go to XYZ websites while at work. Administrative policy tells you not to do that. And then on the other side, you can have a technical control that actually restricts somebody's ability to go to those websites, like some sort of a firewall. So they're two different things, and it's all about how it is applied. If it's applied through the computer, logical, technical. If it's applied to a policy or some sort of business decree from management, it's administrative. And if it's the security is applied to a physical object itself, then it's straight up operational/physical. As for this last one, configuring port security to improve asset identification and location efforts. Port security is something you enable on a router or a switch, something you put on a piece of network hardware that limits what MAC addresses are able to connect to that piece of hardware. This is absolutely something that is configured on a piece of network equipment and thereby is technical in nature. So those would be the proper answers relative to those descriptions. And hopefully this gives you a good feel for how CompTIA views the difference between them. And they're basically just echoing NIST, the National Institute for Standards and Tech, on what these different control categories ultimately are. So, technical, controls implemented in the operating system, in the software, or the security appliance. It has to be inside the computer. Operational controls depend on people for implementation and tend to be physical. And managerial give oversight and or govern how people act. This is our administrative control category. Then there are different types of control. The difference between the types and the categories is when it comes to categories, pick one. You're either technical, operational, or managerial. You're one of the three, but never two different things. With the types, you can be multiple types at the same time, meaning a certain device could also be preventative as well as detective. Can I repeat what I just said? What about the descriptions of each of these control categories? Technical must be inside the computer. Like, it has to be inside the computer. You have to configure it. Operational depends on people for implementation and tends to be physical. I'm hard-pressed to find something that's physical and not also operational, or vice versa, like a lock on a door. You're not wrong. Operational does have some amount of procedure built into it. However, most procedure is actually applied through administrative in the eyes of both CompTIA and NIST. Like the procedure is written, it's administrative. When someone does it, then it's operational. Managerial, the admin side of things, is oversight for the system. It is our policies. It guides people. It tells them how to act. So this is where I would expect policies, procedures, guidelines, frameworks, and all those types of things to be written out. And certainly anything that managerially has been written, anything administrative, will then hopefully persuade people to uphold our technical and operational controls. So back to our types. Preventative, detective, corrective, physical, deterrent, compensating. You could be all 6 of these. You could be 1. You could be 2. You could be 3. Any combination therein. What do we mean by preventative? It takes place before or during the attack to stop it. It actually stops the attack. And if we sort of look at our timeline here, we can see that the best description of preventative is that it precedes and attempts to block an attack, or maybe the attack has started and it prevents it from continuing. It's a very basic definition of preventative. The key difference, though, here between preventative and detective is detective is only there to identify. When someone says something is detective, do not immediately assume it can prevent. Now, most of the time, things that can prevent can also detect. I mean, they'd have to detect in order to prevent. But, they aren't necessarily the same thing. I might be able to detect a crime is taking place, but I might be powerless to stop it, in which case I cannot be preventative. Someone can be detective and not preventative. Someone could be preventative and not detective. Someone could be both. A security guard could detect and then prevent. The key with detection is that it is just there to identify, to alert you as there was something occurring. Corrective, however, unlike those guys, must operate after the fact. It's the Band-Aid you put on the wound. It responds and sort of, limits the impact or helps mitigate the damage of the incident while hopefully also preventing its reoccurrence. A perfect example of a corrective control would be backups. Right? Backups are corrective. Our system just got ravaged by malware. Almost all the computers can't start. Cool. We bring in our backups. That's corrective. It reduces the impact, gets us back on our feet. It didn't prevent the attack. Still happened. Didn't detect the attack. Backups didn't alert us to anything. The backups, however, were used to fix the problem. But you could certainly have something that's all 3. In fact, I would argue that in an operational sense, a security guard is probably all 3. They're capable of detecting something. They're capable of being preventive. They're even capable of helping with the resolution, being corrective. Now, if somebody ever does want to distinguish between operational in maybe something that's operational that isn't physical or something, and they want to make clear that the operational control in play is strictly physical, we do have the control type physical, just to make it extra clear. And this has to be something that physically deters access or physically detects you. Naturally, if something is logical, it cannot be also physical. They're 2 completely separate things. How about deterrent versus compensating? All right, you think these are the less straightforward of the 2, or of the options we have here for different types. Deterrents, they do not detect, They do not prevent. They psychologically discourage someone from performing X, Y, or Z. For example, what about a sign that says, if you cross this line, you will be shot? Like at the front door of, or at the front gate of Area 51. Big old sign that says, trespassers will be shot. That's a pretty powerful deterrent, man. Most powerful deterrent is the threat of bodily harm. I'm not crossing that line because guess what? I don't want to get shot. Now, will they actually shoot me if I cross a line? Maybe, maybe not. The key being is that it psychologically discourages me from proceeding. Same thing's probably true of bright lights. I would agree completely, Thomas. Yes, a sign would be physical and a deterrent. A physical sign, mind you. If it's like a message of the day in a computer, like when you first log into a computer, a little thing pops up and it says, this workstation is for authorized personnel only, that would be a deterrent that's also logical. So you could have like a sign in a computer, in a sense, that is not physical. But your conventional sign would definitely be physical. How about bright lights? Those are a deterrent. How about a security camera? By itself, a security camera is a deterrent. Right? It's a good point, Robert. If you can't hold it in your hand, it's not physical. Yeah, so like I think about like a camera. And nobody's watching the camera. They're just cameras. And maybe they're recording to some location, but nobody's watching them in real time. I would say those are nothing but more than a deterrent. But if someone's watching the camera, the person who is watching the camera is detective. If I'm watching the camera feed, now I'm capable of detecting some intrusion. How about compensating? This is a substitution for when your primary control doesn't work. Would the video be technical or physical or both? Nope, it's purely physical. Does the video feed show you someone hacking into a computer, like in the sense of like logically? No. Unless you're real-time monitoring a computer screen or the data on the network, it's not technical. Like I'm imagining the camera is like aimed at a hallway. We physically see people entering. Thereby, it's physical only. Would not be detecting somebody in a technical sense. Remember, technical has to be inside the computer. And just because the video feed traverses the network does not mean it's detecting things on the network. Does that make sense, Hannah? About compensating. So this is our catch-all for when we a primary control does not pan out. For example, how about this logical preventative control? It's known as passwords. An alert to the management console be technical? Yes, I would imagine so, if it's alerting you about a network intrusion or a computer intrusion. If it's an alert to the management console that tells you someone entered a room, then it's physical. So logical, preventative. How about passwords? You configure passwords to limit who can log into systems. What's the problem with passwords? Sometimes they're too short. Sometimes they're too simplistic. Sometimes they're easily guessed. Sometimes people write them down and put them on a Post-it note on their desk. Passwords have lots of flaws and are not perfect. Does that mean we're never going to use passwords again? No, we use passwords all the time. But what do we like to do in high security environments? We compensate. We compensate for weak passwords, predictable passwords, short passwords, and so forth. Typically, by getting a one-time password token. It's something you have as opposed to the password, which is something you know. So one-time password token is that little button you press and it gives you a PIN number. And you use that PIN number alongside your password to gain access. The catch being that one-time password token is compensating for the passwords not being a perfect control to begin with. Let's say a company has a physical preventative / deterrent fences. But fences aren't perfect. So we compensate by making sure that the doors on the building are sturdy and locked. It's as Bill put it, our plan B. Yeah, it compensates for the main control not being ideal. Absolutely. I would say that any time somebody's performing MFA, multi-factor authentication, some component of that MFA system is a compensation control for a single factor authentication not being secure enough to begin with. All right. Frameworks. What is a framework? Let's say you're going to build a house. You make a frame. You make a foundation. That's what a framework is. It's there to build upon. It's a structure that you can adopt, that you can then use to further develop your own security. As William put it, yeah, it's an outline. It's a guideline for how to develop something. And there's all sorts of frameworks out there. The cybersecurity framework from the National Institute for Standards and Tech. Federal Information Processing Standards, also written by NIST. There are tons of different frameworks. Even the International Standards Organization makes frameworks. You can find frameworks, even open source ones, from a company or an organization known as OWASP. They're all over the place. Frameworks. Good, really good guidelines, just things that you can build upon to develop your own security. We're going to start first about talking about ISO's frameworks, the International for Standards Organization, or the International Organization for Standardization, depending on how you want to say it. Ultimately, the goal of ISO is to make standards and frameworks that we can all use. And on an international level. The difference between this and NIST is the National Institute for Standards and Technology is part of the United States government. It's part of the U.S. government's e-commerce branch. And thereby NIST, while it influences the globe for sure, is not recognized everywhere. The NIST is part of the U.S. government. And outside of the U.S., less noteworthy. This test wants to be worldwide. So we're going to see that ISO stuff pops up way more than anything NIST related. For that reason, I want to make very clear 4 important ISO numbers. Now, how many numbers are there? Oh, hundreds of thousands. But 4 very important ones. ISO number 27001. You're going to find that everything in the 27,000 range is either frameworks, standards, or guidelines for information systems. And basically, if you look up 27,000, it basically tells you as much. Everything in 27,000 will be tied to IT. 27,001 is the very first number we want to know. And its rules and requirements, its standards. A standard is something you can measure against. A standard is something that you want to meet. a certain condition that you want to achieve and possibly surpass. So 27001 is the standards, the rules and requirements for IT security. The 27001 standards have been used to make regulations and laws all over the globe. And an organization, a company, can have an auditor come in and list them as 27001 compliant. And naturally, this would make other companies more comfortable working with them, knowing that they were 27001 compliant. But yeah, this has been used to make laws all over the place, and you can be listed as 27001 compliant. 27002, however, you cannot be listed as 27002 compliant, nor is it really used to make any laws or anything like that. 27002 is best practices, suggestions on how to select controls so that you can become 27001 compliant. So if you follow the 27002, you read through that, it will tell you how to become 27001. But these other two, ISO 27701, International Regulations for Privacy. Now, what are we talking about with privacy here? What's that all about? Company secrets? Well, maybe to some degree. When somebody says privacy, we're talking about keeping employee, customer, and so forth data about a person secret. That's what we're getting at. Not trade secrets, not the secret ingredients to make Coca-Cola, but specifically information about people. We're talking about protecting PII, personally identifiable information. We're talking about keeping that confidential. And again, this 27001 explains how on the international stage, you have to put in certain controls to protect PII. Meanwhile, ISO 31000. The whole 31000 range is about risk management. It's not specifically tied to IT. It's about, essentially, the best practices for managing risk within a company or org. Again, not limited to IT. Basically explains what is quantitative risk analysis, what is qualitative risk analysis, and so forth. These are the 4 ISO numbers that we are expected to know for this test. And I have put this, basically copy-pasted this slide here into the homework for quick and easy reference. Now, are there more than this? Oh, certainly. Certainly. There's cloud standards. There's cloud frameworks. There's risk management frameworks and so forth. Down the line, all sorts of different ISO numbers. And as you can see, we've got thousands of them. What does PII stand for? Personally identifiable information. Yeah, anything that identifies a person, like your date of birth, your social security number, stuff like that. So the International Standards Organization has put together all sorts of different standards, guidelines, and so forth. And many of these different standards that they've created have been then used in various places to make laws, to make legal regulations, which we will talk about shortly. But at least right here at the beginning, let's be familiar with ISO and those 4 numbers. All right. Honorable mention here, not really a big point of the test, but you might hear occasionally of CSA, the Cloud Security Alliance, and they have lists of controls for how to best protect the cloud. They have their own set of frameworks. They have their own set of guidelines and so forth and so on. This organization puts out all sorts of stuff about protecting the cloud and what to expect of a cloud provider. And if you're using the cloud, not a bad thing to familiarize yourself with, but not a gigantic point of this test anyway. We'll see occasional mentions to SSAE. And specifically, they made something known as SOC reports, SOC. There are SOC 1 reports, SOC 2 reports, and SOC 3 reports. SOC 1 reports are about financial stuff. They're about making sure that any reporting the company does on a financial level is accurate, and to make sure that they have controls in place that make sure that their financial reporting is accurate. But SOC 1 is all about finances and making sure the company's got that in order. SOC 2 is what we care about. It's a look into the CIA triad of an organization. How do they protect confidentiality? How do they protect the integrity? How do they provide availability for their systems? So it evaluates a service provider's CIA triad. And of this SOC 2 report, there are Type 1 SOC 2 reports and Type 2 SOC 2 reports. Type 1 is sort of like a snapshot, what controls exist. It doesn't look at how effective they are. It doesn't look at them over time. It just says, here's what they got. They've got a firewall. They have an intrusion prevention system. They have an X, they have a Y, they have a Z. It doesn't look at like long-term stuff. And this can be performed probably in a couple days. A Type 2 report takes weeks, typically months, like 3 months to perform at minimum. And it looks at the controls as they exist over time. What is their long-term effectiveness, and what is the longevity of these controls? Will they last? This is more in depth. This gives you an even better idea of what's going on with the CIA triad at that organization. But these are essentially different types of audits that can be performed on a company. And like if you were about to be a partner with, let's say, Google, they might ask you for a SOC 2 Type 2 report. But ultimately speaking, all right, not a key component of this test, occasionally referenced, but not high on our list like ISO is. The SOC 3 is basically a SOC 2 report that has been heavily altered so that it can be shared with the public. You know, anything that was sensitive has been redacted or removed. Anything that could be used as a weapon against the company or outlines a vulnerability in their system has been removed, so that essentially if attackers or hackers get their hands on this document, they can't use it against the company. But most companies will have a SOC 2 performed, have a SOC 3 made from it, so that they can then share that publicly and, you know, say to people, hey, look, we haven't had a breach in X number of days. Here's proof through our SOC 3 report and so forth. Just so that the public has more confidence in the organization. But in a sense, even this SOC system, this auditing system, gives you an idea as to the effectiveness of your framework and sort of has its own framework built into it for how to perform the audit. There's also CIS, the Center for Internet Security. They have their own risk framework, but they've also got what is known as the CIS 20, or the 20 CIS, a list of 20 crucial controls that you should have for the sake of internet security. I mean, this organization is literally called the Center for Internet Security, so clearly what they're focused on is protecting internet-based systems, anything the internet can access. And then, of course, there are going to be vendor-specific guides for how to configure something. There are going to be vendor-specific frameworks that might be put out by CIS or NIST or even OWASP. And there might even be benchmarks, something that acts sort of like as a foundation, a sort of, minimum set of security requirements that you should be meeting. Again, lots of different organizations have put together different benchmarks or vendor-specific guides. Ultimately, if you deal with lots of Cisco gear, look up Cisco benchmarks. If you deal with lots of Dell gear, look up Dell benchmarks and so forth. Sort of give yourself an idea of what is your minimum set of security settings. And then my hope is that you can surpass that benchmark and be more secure than what it would be considered the bare minimum. But there are also benchmarks out there for software configuration or web server configuration. And let's face it, most software these days connects over the internet and is thereby in some measure web-based. And one of the main organizations for dealing with web-based software and the security frameworks and benchmarks therein is OWASP. And you've heard me mention them a couple times, the Open Web Application Security Project. OWASP is focused on making web-based software stronger and safer. They have their own framework for improving security development known as SAMM, S-A-M-M. They have their own benchmarks depending on whether it's an Apache server or a Microsoft server and so forth. And they have tons of guidelines, just tons of them. In fact, one of the best things that OWASP has is just a list of the top 10 highest threats for any given year. And if you were to look at that today, you'll see that in the last couple of years, the most performed attack against anything that connects to the internet, according to them, is an injection attack, where an end user inputs malicious code into the program, making it do something unexpected. 20 years ago, that would have been a cross-site request forgery as number one, but times have changed. All right. So standards, things we can measure against, things we should meet, sort of expectations for configuration or performance, are frequently used to make regulations, our legislation, our laws. And there's a handful of laws on here that we should be familiar with. How about this first one? SOX, the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Give that an asterisk. This one is about making sure that you do not lie to your investors. Like if a CEO signs a document that says, last year we made $25 million, and then we find out later, oh, that was a giant lie, they can get put in jail for a breach of SOX. So no lying to your investors. How about FISMA? I think we can skip the Computer Security Act. FISMA, Federal Information Security Management Act. How essentially defense contractors or anybody who's going to get involved with the U.S. government has to configure and secure their IT systems. And you have to be FISMA compliant before you can even bid on a government contract. This one is going to get 3 asterisks because it's the most important on the page. The General Data Protection Regulation. Where is this law found? Anybody know where to find this? This is a privacy law. And a landmark one at that. Yeah, this is the EU, the European Union's privacy regulation. One of the hardest hitting laws there is. You do not want to breach this thing. They fine you big time. Essentially, it's a list of rules for how we have to protect employee and customer PII, right? It's about that privacy, about protecting personally identifiable information, protecting people, end users, not company secrets, but rather the people involved with as customers or employees of the company. This thing says, well, several rules, but I'll sort of highlight some of the key ones. You can only collect information you've been given permission to collect. Like the company can't collect information if they haven't been given permission. They can only use the information for things they have been given permission to use it for. So if a company says, we will not use your phone number, we will not sell your phone number to like advertisers, and then they do that literal thing, well, they get permission to do that, they've broken the GDPR. And usually fines for GDPR are like 7% of the business's value or the business's earnings for an entire year. So you don't want to mess with that. Like each fine is giant percentages. Now this general data protection regulation actually goes way back. The OECD in 1980, that's the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development inside the EU, wrote up 8 privacy guidelines. These privacy guidelines in the early 2000s, late 90s, evolved into GDPR. So this concept, this privacy regulation has actually conceptually been around for decades. It's not new, but it is more important now than ever. Organization for Economic and Cooperative Development, or Cooperation and Development, the OECD. Not a test topic anywhere, but it's where the GDPR came from. And ultimately speaking, again, can only use data they can only collect data they've been given permission to collect. Can only use data for things they've been given permission to use it on. They can't collect anything. There's several parts of it that seem redundant. Can't collect anything you haven't been given permission for, but then it also says you can't collect anything that wasn't listed. And it's like, isn't that not the same thing? Yes. But it's there's very redundant parts. One of my favorite rules, though, is known as the right of erasure, or also known as the right to be forgotten. Not part of the OECD's guidelines, but certainly a new component of GDPR and a more recent addition to it, suggests that if a customer says, I want you to delete my information, I don't want you to hold any records on me, the company has to oblige. Of course, there's a loophole with anything that Facebook found, is that if somebody posts something to what is considered a public forum, you are thereby waiving any rights to privacy, and thereby the right of erasure no longer applies, which basically means if you post something on your public feed on Facebook, Facebook now can hold on to that forever, and there's nothing you can do about it. But if you're on a private part of a website, and it is clearly outlined as being private, you can now tell them to delete it, and they are not allowed to keep it. It's a whole thing. As Robert has suggested to me, of course, this is mostly there to keep Google and Facebook and things like that in check. But of course, they're always trying to find ways through it or around it, find loopholes, which is why it's also being updated regularly. Now, this GDPR is a landmark sort of law because this was written by the EU and then is adopted by all sorts of places. And the closest to it that we find in the U.S. is the CCPA, the California Consumer Privacy Act, which copy-pastes a lot of GDPR stuff to protect, end users. Outside of the GDPR and the CCPA, which are all about that PII again, we do have HIPAA, which is about protecting PHI data. PII was our protected identifiable information, or personal identifiable information, depending on who you're talking to. And again, it's things like date of birth, hair color, all things that identify you as a person, your phone number. PHI is personal health information or protected health information, again, depending on who you talk to. And ultimately, PHI is your medical records. And that's what HIPAA is all about, protecting. Then there's PCI DSS. I'm going to give HIPAA an asterisk because that one's important, and I'm going to give PCI DSS an asterisk. I'll put a little slash through CCPA, Gramm-Leach, Biley, and Computer Security Act, since they're really not given any attention anywhere. PCI DSS, the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, is an international standard that's contractual based. It's not enforced by a law, but like pretty much if you deal with anybody on the internet or you deal with a bank, they're going to want you to be PCI DSS compliant. And the idea is that this standard comes into effect whenever you are storing credit card information or debit card banking information. If you're not dealing with the credit card information because you've got like PayPal handling that for you, then you don't have to meet PCI DSS. But like if your company is going to store credit card information or use or run credit card information, you need to be PCI DSS compliant if you're going to be doing business with any of those banks and not expecting them to like fine you or something. And certainly the goal of PCI DSS is by being compliant with this, you can sort of say like, look, we did the required things to protect the credit card numbers, and thereby we performed our due diligence. We went out of our way to meet the standard, and thereby, we shouldn't be fined so heavily for this data breach. Like by following this, you're proving that you're not going to be negligent in your security duties when, protecting that info. So what are some of the PCI DSS rules? Because there's 12 of them. There are 2 PCI DSS rules that I think you should be familiar with. The very first one, this isn't rule number 1, but I think it's actually rule 11, but it's the most important one to know about from a Sec Plus point of view, is that you must test annually. Test the system at least once a year. Once a year, you must have a pen test performed, or at very minimum, a security audit by a professional. And they will come in and tell you whether or not you meet PCI DSS or not, and what your vulnerabilities are, what are your weaknesses, and possibly suggestions on how to fix those. Once a year, you got to have a security test. It's required as per PCI DSS compliance. The second thing is anyone in the organization who has computer access must have a unique account, meaning no account sharing between employees/users on this system. Everybody must have a unique account. Those are the 2 biggest rules. There are ultimately 12 rules inside of PCI DSS. Each rule has like 30 subsections, and it gets kind of convoluted. Which is why you might even have an employee at a company whose entire job is making sure PCI DSS is upheld. But the big 2, again, make sure you have a yearly test, and everybody must have unique accounts. All right. That wraps up lesson number 1. We are now 1 down, 20.